Good? Thanks for coming out. I flew out from California. This is my first Aquashella, so pretty cool, but I think it's like my... All right. Okay, cool. So I didn't really know what I was going to do for a talk, and when I spoke with Sean and a couple of people, we decided I would just do a Q&A because I've been doing this for a while. I have a few different businesses, but then I'm like, Q&As usually there's not a lot of questions, so I'm going to prepare a talk, and I decided to do breaking the barriers to saltwater, setting yourself up for success, being that it seems to be more of a freshwater show with people maybe having 1 foot or a few toes into salt water. I've done both fresh and salt for many, many years, so here we go. I've been a professional aquarist since I was 4. I've been keeping marine animals, fell in love with it at the beach, used to go to Cape Cod, my grandparents. I'm going to do a 4-minute thing on my background because a lot of you guys don't know me, and I don't know most of you. Started working in fish stores when I was 13. It was my hobby. Loved aquariums. A guy opened up a store right near my house every day after school. Instead of doing sports, I would go there and clean tanks. And he was a fisherman, so at night he would fish and then come to work and go to sleep in his car, and I would run the store. So from 13 to 18, I pretty much had my own store. At least it felt that way. Then I had a customer that would come in a lot, and suddenly he didn't come in, and his wife came in, and she said that her husband had a stroke and he could no longer service his aquarium, and I would like to pay you to come to my house and take care of the fish tank. She says, what will you charge? And I said, I don't know, $20. So I went there and serviced his tank. He had 2 tanks, and that was the very first tank I serviced, maybe a 33-gallon tank, and that was in like 1988, 89. Had tanks in my house growing up. I was very fortunate to have really cool parents to let me make spills and floods all over the 2nd floor and let it rain down, especially when I'd be out and we didn't have cell phones to call me on. I'd go home, my dad would be standing in the driveway ready to beat me because the fluval leaked or something happened. But this morphed into me tinkering. I always loved tools and playing with stuff, so I used to build filters for people, and this is a classic wet dry I would build. I probably put 10 of them out in service accounts. Back in the late 80s, first reef tank, late 80s, 89, 90. Back then we had to do most of our own stuff. You couldn't just go buy an LED light or even a hood to just hang on your tank. So you went to the store, you bought wood, you wrapped it with aluminum foil, you bought the power supplies, you wired it up, and you used whatever you had to make it work. That hang-on filter was actually a Super King box that I drilled a hole and put some PVC fittings to send water into a sump. Then kept going, servicing and installing aquariums in New York City, and Long Island. This is a 5,000-gallon tank. It was the biggest tank I serviced for a few years, filled with sharks and rays. I loved it. And then a bunch of tanks in the city. This was pretty representative of the type of work that we strive to do. Contractors, architects would call us up, would go in and do the bid, do the install, and then maintain it. We still have about 20 people in New York City. It's my business. It's called Manhattan Aquariums. It's on the west side. That's Sean Hale trying to meditate with all the sounds and buzzing from the lights and the pumps. It's on the west side of Manhattan. If you're ever in the city, go check it out. I'm actually going there tomorrow night, and I'll be there Monday. I'll be there. And then we opened up the aquarium shop in Long Island. We took over the Aquarium Village, which is a nice big store. This is the fish room. We kind of redid most of it, and then the dry good room. We opened it all up, made it really nice and comfortable, put dehumidification in there, and people are enjoying it. I also do Marco Rocks in Florida with Mark Tetrault, and for aquascaping purposes, even for freshwater, it's a great inert, dry rock, and it's something that I used to use for a lot of my aquariums, and I had an opportunity to join the company in around 2017. All right, and then unique corals, which most people know me from the West Coast. I moved to the West Coast 2012. We import corals, we grow corals, we sell corals. I love corals, it's my passion. We actually don't make a lot of money doing this because it's a labor of love. But as you can see, we're good at it, and that's what we do. And then I decided that I wanted to have a better source for corals, so we expanded to the Solomon Islands, which is this island chain kind of off Australia. And I partnered with one of my previous employees, Tim Kelly, and he built this facility on the water. And now we have access to our own corals, which we ship in probably every 2 to 3 weeks. That's our view from the office looking out. We have a pump in the ocean. We pump water in, send it back out. So when we collect the corals, they're in natural seawater, and trying to deal with pumps and testing and everything in a third world country like this is not easy. Okay, so now you know a little bit about me. What I would say is to identify your goals. When you're setting up a saltwater tank, if you've had fresh water, it's kind of like an Amano style, which takes a lot of time. You're constantly in there trimming and pruning and maintaining, and it can go out of balance pretty quickly, versus just a community. You go to your store, you buy a bunch of fish, you have a busy schedule, you have maybe 20, 30 minutes a week to spend on the aquarium. Reef tanks can be like that too. And when you see all these tanks on Instagram and Facebook, some of them take a lot of time to keep them looking the way they do, and some don't. So I would try to take a step back and identify the goals that you're trying to keep. For instance, this is a tank owned by Juan Gabriel in Mexico, and this tank, I mean, he's always playing with it. He's doing weekly ICP tests. He's manipulating the water chemistry, trying to keep every trace element balanced, just, trying to keep it really, really perfect. And to maintain these colors constantly with a small volume of water with this much coral density, it's using up a ton of calcium, a ton of alkalinity. So if you have any blip or anything goes off, it's going to suffer. I mean, those corals, that alkalinity could drop like 2 points in one day. On the other side, this is a soft coral tank that I had in my home for a while. Very low maintenance. You don't even need a calcium reactor. You can just do a water change every few weeks, and that'll replenish a lot of the ions. It's mostly lit with sunlight. I've got a giant mangrove in there, the Julian sprung. Joe mentioned him. Like I said, he is an up-and-coming aquarist, and we're all rooting for him. But that mangrove is something that is like his signature thing. Julian's mangroves up next to his mangoes. Anyway, so soft coral tanks, really, really easy to care for. And when you go diving, especially when you go snorkeling, that is what you're going to see. You're going to see all these beautiful soft corals bathed in sunlight, and so the connection between the natural environment and your home tank is actually more fitting. It's better connected when you have a soft coral tank. And you can have all the cool animals, all the cool inverts, all the cool fish with a soft coral. You don't need to have a very complex SPS system. Okay, sight words. I apologize if you guys know all these, but I just wanted to kind of bring it down just to make sure, because you see all these things being posted. WYSIWYG is what you see is what you get. That's how most people advertise their corals. Fowler, fish only with live rock. That's a kind of a method for keeping fish in a system, kind of a sterile system with live rock, so you get the surface area for colonies of bacteria to grow, but you don't have actual corals growing on the rock. You remember we used to keep decorated systems with bleached corals, and when I used to do the maintenance, we'd have to take all the corals out and bring them home, take new corals that we had previously bleached and bring them to the job site and put them in the tank. People stopped doing that. They swapped out for live rock. The tank just ran more stable. SPS versus LPS, small polyp stony versus large polyp stony versus softy. It's kind of the morphology of the coral. When you look at it, it's got a lot of small polyps. It's going to be a little trickier to keep. All those beautiful acropora, the reef building corals, those are all SPS. LPS, think long and flowy, euphyllia, torch corals, hammer corals, stuff like that. PAR is photosynthetic available radiation. That's kind of the amount of light energy in the wavelength of usable energy hitting those corals. So it's a pretty good indicator of how much light corals need. So like on our website, Unique Corals, we list the desired PAR window for most corals. So if it's an SPS coral, we'll tell you 250 to 500. And of course, these are not fixed numbers. You can have higher nutrients, you can have lower PAR, and the coral will do fine. So light is a food source for the corals. And you can measure that with a pretty expensive meter. Bulk Reef Supply used to loan them out. You'd rent it for a week, you'd measure, you can adjust your lighting, and then you'd send it back. They do something like that now, but I recommend if you have a local fish group or fish club, usually they own a PAR meter and you can borrow it, because to own something that's that expensive, you're not going to be using it all that often. ICP testing, that's ICP stands for inductively coupled plasma. That's a method of testing where we look at the actual atoms of the water. So we can tell you in parts per million or even parts per billion what your concentration is of unwanted heavy metals, major ions, stuff like calcium, magnesium, and you can see trends in the water, and you can see if something's building up that might potentially lead to an issue. I actually was the first one to offer ICP testing in the US in 2014 and 15 after a trip to Germany to visit Ozone, who's kind of the guy that took ICP testing and adapted it to reef keeping. And then I remember bringing back a bunch of ICP tests in my suitcase, and we started offering Triton tests. And now you can buy them from 4 or 5 different companies here in the US. But it was great because back then we kind of cleaned up the industry, not intentionally, but all of a sudden people were armed with a tool that they can now test their aquarium, and it was a $50 test. And they can see that, oh wow, I have aluminum at 300 ppb in my water. Well, how did it get there? Well, now I'm looking at these bottles that I keep my calcium and magnesium in that I buy from the store, and they're aluminum bottles. Well, the aluminum is getting into my calcium and my magnesium, and I'm dosing aluminum every time I put it in my aquarium. So this kind of trickled back to the manufacturers, especially with salt manufacturers and two-part manufacturers, to source better ingredients, to spend a little bit more money. So it definitely had a positive net effect on the industry. Not to mention all of the marine breeders. There's a lot of examples where we helped people spot an issue where they couldn't get larvae past a certain stage, and it turned out to be an unwanted heavy metal in the water. Anyway, so that is more advanced stuff, and if it fits into your budget and you're really passionate and enjoying this hobby, then I do encourage you to do a test, to get a baseline, but it's certainly not something you need to do to be successful. Sump versus filter, believe it or not, a lot of people say, what's the difference? A sump literally is your filter. It's the vessel, the box that's underneath the aquarium, and you just put a bunch of stuff in it. It's really in a saltwater aquarium just to maintain a fixed water level, to keep your filtration parts, your heater, your carbon, the fine bubbles from your skimmer, so a lot of that stuff doesn't react with your display aquarium. It kind of gives you, it's like the workshop for the aquarium. And then a filter kind of denotes a more purposeful filter, like a refugium or a wet-dry filter. Fuge versus algae reactor versus refugium. Fuge is just shortened refugium. It's just an area attached to a display system for pods and microfauna and more bacteria and maybe algae cultures and stuff to grow that helps balance the aquarium. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit too. Okay, larger tanks are more stable. If you have the ability to get a larger aquarium with marine aquaria, it always or typically runs more stable. One thing that you kind of want to wrap your head around is you have at natural seawater levels, let's say specific gravity 1.026, you have the set amount of magnesium, calcium, alkalinity. If you have 1 coral in there or 10 corals, they're all pulling minerals from that bank of ions. So the larger the pool you have to pull from, the less resistant it is to change. And especially with SPS corals, they can't handle change. Coral reefs have been dubbed to be the most stable environments on Earth. So these animals don't possess strong mechanisms to deal with change. So it's on us to create a very stable system for them. And a great way to do that is to have a larger body of water. It's also very resistant. As you know, you try to change the temperature on a large body of water, it takes a lot of energy to bring it up or bring it down. Well, that's all going to work to your advantage. When the power goes out, your oxygen levels will stay higher in a larger aquarium. I mean, they won't get used up as quickly. Pretty self-explanatory, I would hope. Glass versus acrylic, there's endless debates on all this stuff. I'm just giving you my years of experience, my quick and dirty on this. I like glass aquariums, but if I had the tank in a school and there was a bunch of kids, I would go for a thicker acrylic aquarium. Why? Because if there's a little fight or somebody goes into it, acrylic's probably not going to break where glass might. Also, if somebody keys the front of a tank, that glass tank is done. The acrylic tank can be resurfaced and buffed out. As far as it like turning yellow or something, I don't think good quality acrylic loses its clarity. I've never seen it. My tank at home is from 2005, and after I clean it or if I buff it, it looks as clean as it did the day I bought it. So maybe there are cases where the acrylic kind of got hazy over time, but I think it's probably a lack of maintenance rather than an inherent issue with the acrylic itself. I'm not an acrylic expert, just my thoughts on that. Weight, strength, and structure. Again, should be common sense, but I've heard of a lot of stories where people put a heavy tank on the second floor, and not that the floor is going to break and the tank's going to go through, but it's going to sag. If you put the tank in an area where your floor is not strong enough, these houses are not built to hold 8.3 pounds per gallon. You extrapolate that weight, it's over 1,000 pounds in most decent sized aquariums. So you don't want any kind of sagging. So just be very mindful when you do that. And typically, if you put the aquarium closer to the walls are where your strength is. That's what's carrying the load of the span. Well, that vertical strength of that load-bearing wall is going to be your strongest point. We've often, in offices, when somebody wants an aquarium there, we say, well, can we put it there? Because the floor can hold a lot more, and then we usually wind up putting it there. Electric cost and battery backup. Thankfully, equipment has gotten a lot more energy efficient than it did years ago. We used to have to run chillers to cool the water because the heat that was put off from the pumps and the lights would have to then be removed by another piece of filtration. Chillers are not that common anymore. Well, I shouldn't say that. We don't have to install them as often as we used to. Simply because as long as there's some breathing going on and the system can evaporate, the heat displacement from the pumps and the lights don't automatically require you to need a chiller like we did back then. But certainly something to keep in mind, the more equipment you go with, the more you're going to spend on electricity. If you look at what's happening in Europe and Germany, where they're paying a fortune now for electricity, a lot of people are selling the aquariums because that's the first thing to go on the list. It's pretty sad. Keep things for hurricanes, for storms, power outages. Now you can buy on Amazon battery backups where you can plug your pumps and everything into, so if the power goes out, you can have a lot of power there. You don't need your lights for a few days. You just need flow. The animals need oxygen. I remember we had a bad hurricane in New York City. In 24 hours, we had the power out in Manhattan. And I spent the whole time in my office just manually lifting water up with a pitcher and pouring it back in. Lifting it up about 2 feet out of the water, pouring it back in. Just creating that splashing and agitation was enough to keep all the corals and all the fish alive by oxygenating and doing that gas exchange for them. But you can do that with battery-powered air pumps. You don't want to be sourcing this stuff when the power goes out. What method should I use? I actually should have deleted this line because it's a little bit too well, it's probably beyond. There's a lot of different methods for reef keeping, but they're all rooted with the same foundation, using live rock as the main surface area to grow your bacteria, and some kind of ion addition, calcium reactor, 2-part dosing. Now people are doing constant water changes. The trick is to really pick a method and stick with it. Find somebody who's successful if you're new at it, and kind of emulate what they did to get the results. It's like a recipe. When you're going to cook bake an apple pie, you find a recipe and you do it. You don't take 6 recipes and take a few ingredients from each one. It's not going to be apple pie. It's going to be a mix of something that kind of resembles apple pie. So pick a method. I would say stick to it, but also don't be closed-minded. And if you see it failing, obviously you need to abort. I love the Triton method. It's something I fell in love with years ago, but all of these methods work. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Piece together parts are all in one. A lot of the system manufacturers now have listened to people and they put it all together. You know, it was very hard to go out and you have to find this skimmer and this light and this heater and that. So now the manufacturer kind of lumping it all and everything is integrated so it works very well together. I love the tanks. Our Red Sea water box, the stands are actual wood. The plumbing works, it's good. You have valves that you can raise the water level in the overflow box so they're quiet. You don't have to have those noisy overflows anymore. And then here's the biggest thing. Can I make money on my system? And we were having a talk at the bar last night, some of us, and we said, well, why are so many people getting into this and spending so much money that we don't think they can afford on these corals that are hundreds of dollars for a frag? And we came to the conclusion that there's this belief that there's an ROI, that Instagram and Facebook has created maybe this culture where you can grow these corals, they look amazing, and you can cut them and pay for your hobby. Well, I don't know the percentage of people that are successful in doing that. But if you're good at it, and we buy corals from people, you can make your money back and then some. But I don't want people to think, oh, this is a justification. This is going to work to my cognitive bias, or I'm going to lie to my partner or my significant other that this tank will be free because it'll pay for itself. Most of the time, it will not. This is one of our working tanks at Unique Corals. We actually just moved everything from one facility to the other. This tank is less than a week old, but when you know what you're doing and you know the needs of the aquarium, you can do stuff like this. This doesn't mean you can set up a tank and fill it with corals right away, but we're testing 5 times a day, we're changing water, we're doing whatever it takes to keep these corals happy. We've also mimicked the same lighting schedule, the same PAR value, the same alkalinity, the same salt level, the same everything as the tank that these corals just came from. But this is a working farm that you can make a lot of money on. You have all the mother colonies, you snip them as they grow, you advertise them, you photograph them, and you sell them. Years ago, nobody sold frags, they traded frags. And I feel like there's gonna be a resurgence, and I encourage people to do that, because that's the best way to fill your tank up with frags, is to trade them with people. But being a realist in the times that we live in now, most people are selling this stuff. So it's not a bad thing. This person is, again, this is Juan's tank in Mexico, and he's got gorgeous corals, and he makes good money selling his frags. But he also tries to keep the colonies at a good size, so when you're looking at it, it resembles a mature, healthy reef. And there's ways to frag the coral so you don't see the cut. You can trim them in the back. So if you got a beautiful piece, you don't want to just cut right into it. You could take it out, trim it, or trim the side that's growing a little bit more, and then flip it around and glue it back in. But you have to be very mindful of that when you're aquascaping your tank. What is the goal of the aquarium? What are these, and do I need them to be successful? Live rock versus dry rock. Well, I'm an owner of a dry rock company, and I would say dry rock is great, but you will have problems if you don't add or inoculate with something live. It's going to take a long time. You're going to go through a pretty long, ugly phase. I would recommend, if you go with dry rock, you're not going to get pests, you're not going to get any organisms from the wild that you don't want, but I would keep the lights off for a couple of months if you can. Or if you have the ability to put that rock in someone's tank that's established, that's healthy, you do run the risk of having some organisms colonizing there that you may not want. But the good thing is, most of the pests that would eat corals are found near the corals. They're not lurking in your sump on the rock, typically. So definitely, if you go with dry rock, you want to get good bacteria and inoculate your system. Ozone, save that for the pros, save that for people with very deep tanks where you'll have like a bacterial haze. Let's say your tank is 5 feet front to back. Every once in a while, you're going to have a bacterial haze that's going to make it slightly cloudy. Well, the UV or ozone will take care of that. Ozone will also help you keep your redox potential higher. It's kind of like running the tank, just like adding pure oxygen to it. The tank just runs a little bit healthier. But again, that's something for 2.0 or 3.0. It's not something you need in the beginning. UV sterilizer, again, the debate goes back and forth. If the fish are healthy enough to not need, sorry, let me take that back. When the fish are healthy and they're not being stressed, their immune system can fight off most pathogens that they're going to encounter in a typical aquarium. When the fish are stressed, or when you have fish going in and out, or you have what's called conspecifics, like 3 different tanks, same size, all beating each other up, their immune system is going to be suppressed. A UV sterilizer might help to keep pathogen levels a little bit lower. I like using UVs on reef because it does kill some free-floating dinos. Helps keep that water clear. We do a lot of photography, and I can count on the water being ultra clear by having UV. It's a very cheap and easy way to keep clear water. But in the beginning, you don't need it. And, you'll get an ick outbreak, and then you'll say, oh, if I only bought a UV. I've had ick outbreaks on tanks with UV sterilizers that are massive. The ick is just so good at evading it and just staying on that fish and not going through that UV sterilizer. Calcium reactor versus liquid dosing. Dosers are easier. Go at a 2-part or a 3-part solution and liquid dose, and save the calcium reactor for someone who's, when you're a little bit more advanced. It's a little bit more money up front to get it. You might get better stability from it, like rock solid alkalinity and calcium, but it's a lot of tinkering. There's a lot of failure points on it. And once that thing fails a couple of times on you, you're going to want to throw it out the window and go to Kalkwasser or liquid dosing. It's funny, Joe brought up Kalkwasser. Everybody ran Kalkwasser when we first started. It was like the magic ingredient. And then manufacturers couldn't make money on it, so they created these 2-parts with trace elements and everything. And these are very good solutions, but they require multiple head dosing. And you got to test different things. Kalkwasser just wasn't cool anymore. People just kind of steered in favor of 2-part or 3-part dosing, and they're all good. But Kalkwasser is really amazing. It keeps your pH high, maintains alkalinity, calcium, oxygen. It's just a great thing. It also precipitates phosphates out if you're dosing directly into the aquarium. So I would definitely check that out as well. Sand or a bare bottom. I don't like the look of a bare bottom tank, and it's very prone to getting bacterial hazes. Sand is great. But it is going to add a little bit more maintenance to your regimen. When it's dirty, it does not look good. You have all this slime and crud around it, and you can have corals growing on the bottom of your aquarium. So if you do bare bottom, more of that waste will end up in your filter where it will more easily be exported, so that's a plus, but it might cloud the system up, especially when it's new. In fact, like 7 out of 8 bare bottom systems we've set up have gone cloudy at one point, and we just slap a small UV on it, sterilize it, and then the water gets clear again. Protein skimmer, yes, I would do a protein skimmer on your system. I don't want to get too in-depth here, but protein skimmer is going to oxygenate the water. It's going to export waste. It's just going to balance the system. It's a great tool to have on your reef system. Wave pumps, remember, coral reefs, that wave energy is insane. If you ever go diving or snorkeling, it's hard to just stay in one spot because the wave's always moving. That's what we're trying to emulate in a reef system. Very important to create that for the corals. The corals don't have arms just to go up and grab waste when it settles. So if hours and hours go by and waste sits on them, like on a cup coral or a leather coral, it'll rot and start to deteriorate right through that coral. As organic matter decomposes, it creates acids, and that burns holes in it. So you need that flow or a lot of fish to move that waste off of them. Went over ICP testing, chillers went over, aquarium controllers. I love aquarium controllers, but my recommendation is probably to not get one in the beginning, because having to hand test and really stay connected to your aquarium is going to allow you to be intimate and form a much deeper understanding of the needs of the aquarium. An aquarium controller replaces a lot of the hands-on things that you do, and then there's always, do you monitor or do you control? I like to call it aquarium monitors. I don't like to give up too much control to a device. If that device fails or it goes offline, and granted, things have gotten a lot better nowadays. There's default settings that don't shut everything down. But still, for monitoring, it's great. You can get an alert on your phone that your pH or your wattage just dropped, or your lights are off or something, and that's very usable information. Pods, bacteria, all great stuff, but again, the marketing on this stuff is insane. It's, every manufacturer tells you got to add this stuff all the time. I don't think Joe Aiello with his 20,000 gallon tank is pouring pods in there every 3 days. He's not dosing bacteria all the time. Once you maintain that system and you've got some momentum, the tank is like a freight train. It wants to run itself. You don't have to keep pouring your money into the aquarium. But in the beginning, yes, a lot of these things will help. Pods are actually going to eat the dinos, that brown stringy stuff. Put some pods in there. They're going to take care of that. Use nature, use natural stuff to take care of it. But once it's going, no, in my opinion, you don't need to keep adding a lot of that stuff. Coral foods, yes. Corals are animals. They have polyps. They capture food. At night, those polyps are out, and they're capturing food from the water column. During the day, they're fortunate enough to have evolved to have algae living in their tissues to use that sunlight that's above them. But if there's any fish in the tank that's nipping on them, well, now they can't do prey capture during the day as well, so they're forced to only grab sunlight. But they're animals, and they have a high metabolism. They need a lot of food. So if your lighting might not be up to par, and your nutrient levels are low and you're not feeding them enough, there's a good chance those corals are just barely hanging on, just getting enough energy to survive. But if you want to have any hopes of spawning them... All right, I'm going off too much of a tangent. You get the idea. And there's only 1 or 2 more of these, and then we got a bunch of pictures. Tips and tricks: never use non-sealed wood on a stand. I've seen a lot of tanks break because water drips down the side from whatever reason, and unsealed wood swells up, as you know. It's like a sponge. It can double in size. Well, when one corner of that aquarium swells up, what do you think happens to that bottom panel? It gets torqued and it cracks. So if you're going to build your own stand, that's great. Build it right, where wood on wood. Don't have the weight on the screws or the hardware. Have it wood on wood. And then you want to always seal it really well with a polyurethane. It'll last forever. Always level and shim it. Make sure, and even if the tank is a little bit leaning forward, a little bit leaning back, or a little bit left to right, that's much better than having the corners twisted, because the water is going to want to level it out, and it's going to put so much stress on that bottom panel. But always try to shim it, and I don't like using wood shims for the same reason we treat the stand. I like to use composite shims because they don't swell up if they get wet. And then floating the tank on a rubber mat. I go to Home Depot and I buy this yoga exercise mat. All the glass tanks we put are on this 3/8 rubber mat. And that'll help pick up any differences where the stand might not be perfectly level. It might not be touching the bottom of the tank as well. Gravity-fed auto top-offs. You want to limit your liability. A lot of people buy an RO system and then they run the float right onto their sump. Well, that's great until it doesn't work. Now the RO is in constant free flow mode. Not only is it going to overflow your sump, but it's going to drop your salinity and kill all your animals as well. So you always want to limit how much water is being designated for auto top off. So if you know that you have a reserve of 1 week, well, every week you got to top that up. On all of my stores and systems, I have an RO that feeds a tower that's, say, 50 gallons or 75 gallons, and that is what feeds the auto top off or the sump. And then we just fill that tower once a week or every 2 weeks. In fact, at Unique Corals, we have a pump on a timer. It's on for 3 minutes a day, and it pumps water into that 50-gallon vat. And that vat is what's responsible for topping up the systems. And that allows us to see if there's any problems. We can always go and just adjust the timer or something. Using LLC, this is sounding more complicated, but when you set up an RO system or any kind of auto top off, you really want to make sure you do it right. You don't want to have any chance of failure. Float valves, I call them dumb because they don't have any kind of brain. They could have something clogged in them and they're not going to close all the way and they're going to continue to drip water. So you want to put them above a liquid level controller of some sort. Spectra Pure makes a really good vacuum sensor tube, and this senses the water in your sump and will turn a brain on. It's a smart device. It turns either a pump on or a solenoid that allows water to flush into your sump. And it keeps a very precise water level, and the water enters your sump through a float valve above. So if the LLC should ever fail, at least you have that float valve as your backup or your secondary. Camera on the system, so if you're away, you can spot and see if there's any issues. We talked about monitor versus controlling, and then less equipment is better. A lot of people like to turn their tanks into science experiments. That's just adding so many more variables to your system and so many more failure points. Reduce your failure points, come up with a very tight system that's going to work, and limit the amount of variables. Use herbivores. For algae control, you don't want to limit your algae growth with light nutrients. In the beginning when the tank is new, that might be good, but remember, algae is going to grow with any amount of light, any amount of nutrients, so it doesn't really make sense to try to limit those and starve out the tank to prevent algae when you have a very natural solution. You have snails, abalone, tangs, and once they're healthy and they're doing their thing, they're not going to let any algae grow. Maybe some nuisance algae that you can deal with, but most algae is going to be taken care of by them. Use natural organisms, pipefish to scavenge flatworms, wrasses to scavenge little red bugs and black worms, black bugs and stuff. And most of the time they can keep these things in check. This is all pretty self-explanatory. Lars, again, Joe Eulo came up with that. Once a tank is on autopilot and it's cruising, it's very easy to say, well, you know, my pump broke, but the tank looks great, and I got a trip to go on, so I'll take care of it in 2 weeks when I get back. And then you get back, and life gets in the way, and then another pump goes, or your light bulb is on schedule to get maintained or changed or something. You start adding up all these things, and all of a sudden the system just crashes. It says, I can't take enough. The back of the aquarium, kind of like the back breaks, and boom, now you've entered that place you don't want to be. So a lot of the success comes in being proactive and not reactive. Stay on top of your maintenance. You're maintaining a good environment. You're not fixing a bad environment. Momentum happens. Once you get that tank running, I remember Isan in Germany with his famous aquarium, which I think is coming up. He's like, I don't do anything. I just put food in the tank. I could literally put anything I want in the tank. The tank is like a grinder on high speed, like a blender. It just blends anything up. The tank just cruises. And you've seen these reef tanks that kind of get to that point. They look like they take so much work. They took a lot of work to get there, but once they're in cruise mode, you're just maintaining. You're like a pilot cruising at 35,000 feet. He just got his feet back, switches this, adjusts that, fixes this. And that's the idea of a lot of these reef aquariums, is to get them to that point. And stability is key. No matter what the system you go with, no matter what the method, you're trying to create a very natural, stable environment. This tank right here, this is a video of Juan's tank. This is running the Triton method. And one thing that kind of was a mind opener for me when I saw it, when I saw the first Triton tank in Germany, is there's no water changes. Well, typically they don't do water change, and that kind of flies in the face of everything we've heard. Water changes your friend. Water changes I need to flush out waste and replenish trace elements. Well, the way the Triton method works is you kind of look at a water change as a tool, and if the tank doesn't run any better with the water change, then you can leave that tool in your toolbox until you need it. Water changes dilute waste, and they concentrate minerals. So when let's say some of your levels are low, you do a water change, you're adding some of those ions. That's a good thing. But if you can dose those ions every day, the trace elements, the magnesium, the calcium, every day, and then verify how much the tank needs through, say, ICP testing, you don't need to do water changes as often, or eventually not as all. And there's so many examples of successful reef tanks that haven't done water changes in a year or two. Sure, they take some water out when they want to sell frags or when they clean their skimmer cup, but by and large, they're not doing regular water changes as part of their regular regimen, and the tanks run great. This is Ison's tank in Germany with his giant 3-foot clam. Again, he hadn't done water changes on this in years. Elements go in, protein skimmer removes a lot of the waste, giant algae bed, scavenging nutrients, keeping phosphates and nitrates in check, and also adding phytoremediation. Algae is great at locking up some toxic compounds. So when you have a large enough algae bed, it's going to add some component of health to that ecosystem that's hard to quantify. But algae is great at that. This is the ICP machine. So this is using argon gas to test your water, and then you'll get your results. This is an algae bed in a typical Triton tank, or really any tank that runs a refugium. You want a nice, big, healthy algae bed, and then you can scavenge the algae out of that and throw away the nutrients. And we're not the only ones to do it. You see on this system here, this is a Catamorpha baffle that's created 3 inches under the water level. So the theory is the water is just passing through this sponge-like algae. And then he goes in with a scissor and takes off about 2 inches every week to week and a half, throws that away, and lets the new algae grow into the flow. This is a Catamorpha reactor called the Paxbellum. A little bit tricky. Sometimes it's a little hard to dial in. You need a lot of flow for these. But once they're growing and they're doing well, the algae grows like gangbusters because of the proximity of the algae to the light source. It's right there. This is actually out of order. This was the filter where you take a scissor and you just cut it because the algae grows really well growing into the flow. And then this was at Harbor Branch. We took a tour there last year, and this is the same methodology. They're employing natural seagrasses and mangroves to export nutrients from a tank that has like 800 pounds of fish in it. They've also got other cultures, and what they're trying to do is create these off-the-grid future sustainability projects where they can have oysters and urchins and fish and shrimp and algae and marine plants people can eat that recycles like 96% of the waters, something like that they're up to. 95 to 96% of the water is the same water. They don't have to add new water. And the mangroves are just sucking out all that nutrition, all that waste. They've got ova latuca, sea lettuce, growing in these giant bins under sunlight, and they're just bubbling it. And every couple of days, they've got to harvest out hundreds of pounds of this ova and then just stack it in piles on the ground because they have too much to feed to all their fish. But they're exporting nutrients. And it's crazy because the pH going into these systems from the main fish holding system is like 6.8 because of all that carbonic acid that's dissolved. And then it comes out of here like 9.0 or something ridiculous. But the overall system pH is like 8.1. And they've actually got a calcium reactor without carbon dioxide being injected. It's just taking the effluent from one of these giant 800-pound fish tanks, just running straight through a calcium reactor, dissolving the media. So when you want to know what your water level is, maybe after a couple of months, you want to see if there's anything developing, any unwanteds, this is what a typical ICP evaluation would look like. It would tell you your water versus natural seawater and what you're deviating, and then if there's any action that you need to take indicated by a warning lamp. Again, this is 2.0, and I'll be around all weekend if you guys have any questions and you want to pull me and you just pick my brain, I'll be here. Jamie Craig spawns coral. We're doing a lot of spawning now by emulating the natural environment and the lighting cycles found on certain reef locations around the world. So this is where all this evolution, all this technology has ended up. 30 years ago, we could barely keep a stony coral in an aquarium. Now we're spawning them and we're understanding them. In fact, the first picture on my talk was a Galaxia, and that's a coral that we just brought in 2 weeks ago for the Clevis lab in Maryland, and they're spawning Galaxia and getting tomorrow's scientists to understand and spawn these corals to one day hopefully play a bigger role in keeping and maintaining our coral reefs healthy. This is just some rock structures. The trend nowadays, I'm going to actually skip this one because we're getting tight on time. This is my home fish room. I took a 2-car garage and I actually converted it into my dream home fish room. But it's funny because I thought I'd want a lot of salt water. So I set it all up with salt water, and then I realized that my true love is freshwater. that was the hook, the passion hook that got me involved in this. And I went down this whole long journey. It's been like 35 years now. So I ripped out the saltwater in favor of freshwater. And that saltwater tank now is at my showroom in Unique Corals. And that's where I do a lot of my work. I've got some antique tanks in there, a 1850s Fisk tank. I've got you can't see it, but it's in another spot, a 1920s Jewel aquarium with just a betta fish in there, no filtration, live plants, and then a whole bunch of just freshwater biotopes. The tank in the back's 1,200 gallons. It's 8 feet long, 5 feet front to back, 4 feet high. It's an Amazon biotope. And this to me is where I can really kind of detach from my saltwater days and just deal with freshwater. So it's okay to go from fresh to salt and then go back to fresh. And that's it. So if you guys have any questions and answers, I'm here, and thank you for having me out. And Joe, I know, yeah. Well, if there's oh, you got a question? Nano tanks, I think as long as you don't get too unrealistic with what you're trying to keep in it, because, at the end of the day, we're trying to keep living animals, so we don't want to create a cruel science experiment for them. But that said, if you know what you're doing and you're trying to keep soft corals and stuff that can handle some fluctuations in temperature and pH and salinity, a lot of tide pool organisms would do great in there. And certainly you could test your luck with some of the hardier SPS maybe. But I don't really have a strong opinion either way on them, but it's a great way, especially if there's somebody who has limited space or a budget. I lived in Manhattan. My smallest apartment was 300 square feet. That's all I could fit was a nano aquarium, so I actually had one. So it's a great stepping stone to get your feet wet and see if you really like the hobby before you invest even more money in a large aquarium, because you never get back what you put into it. I'm sorry? Absolutely. Really, live rock would be great for any system. Live rock has kind of been poo-pooed on because it kind of got a bad rap. Well, you don't know what you're getting. There could be pests. And yes, that's true. But for years, that was the cornerstone, the foundation to successful aquariums was live rock. So you can't just throw all that success out the window. Certainly, dry rock is easier. It comes in a box. It's cheaper to ship. You can aquascape it, glue it together, create these really gravity-defying aquascapes. But you will have problems unless you inoculate. You have to put good bacteria or put something from an established system in there. Go to a friend's or a store and buy some crud or junk, some sand from the tank. That's going to be chock full of stuff. Yep. I can't. Sorry, that music pumping. Something about bioblooms.
Yeah, for continual bioblooms in a saltwater tank after water changes, you were talking about the UV sterilization.
Yeah.
Do you think that would help hold, like a canister filter, hold the bacteria and sterilize it so it wouldn't cloud up the tank?
So anything you can add, like surface area, to create more stability in the system will counter the chances of having a bacteria bloom. So if you have a canister filter, which I don't really like in salt water, they don't breathe. If they get clogged, all your bacteria is going to die. So I'd rather you just go with a sump and have surface area inside your aquarium. But any system, if the surface area is in a canister filter or on the surface area of the live rock, if it's still new, the system is just going to go through its changes, and a bare bottom tank is just prone to getting these bacteria blooms. But if you took sand from, say, an established aquarium or rock from an established aquarium and put it in your sump or put it in a cup or something, all those things are going to limit the odds of you having a bacterial bloom. Yep. Or pull a canister filter off of another established system just to kind of jumpstart that tank for a few months until you're up and running, and then disconnect the canister filter and put it back wherever it came from. Anything else?
Attention, Aquashella Chicago. Unfortunately, Mark Callahan, Mr. Saltwater Tank, had an injury and isn't able to be here today. So Mark Levinson has offered to kindly step in today and give his talk today and tomorrow. So we're bummed that you're going to miss it tomorrow.
Great.
You're not coming back. At 1 o'clock on the main stage is Mark Levinson.
Cool. And got another Mark so quickly. That's great. Awesome. All right, well, I'm going to... If that's it, we had 2 Joes, and well, anyway, enough jokes. All right, I'm around if you guys have any questions. Thank you.